Hello and welcome to the second class's recap video. This probably will be also in two parts. And so the whole class today will be talking about physics and kind of how to either move our player with physics and also interact in a collision system with other objects by physics, so clashing into other things. Now, as we start, this first section will be over the movement. So when we finished last class, we should have had a ship that moves. And that's great. It's awesome. It's pretty visual. It's nice to have something that moves. But it's the problem that comes up with this is if you look at our script, we have our setup here. But secretly what translate does is it's more like a teleport than a move, right? So if we have our player ship, right? And say we are moving 5, if you're saying translate 5, it would be you're right here now, and then suddenly you're 5 units over, right? So there's nothing, you're just kind of like teleporting between these 2 points. You don't do what might be kind of logical and say, oh, I'm going to drag and kind of move from that point to the 5 point. It's purely just a teleport. So you teleport from 0 to 5. And so that doesn't work so well when you start to want to use things that have to collide with each other and have a physical interaction with each other. So we're going to move away from this. It is very useful to know, though, for this stuff, we're going to be using stuff like an if statement, asking a question. We're going to be using input keys, key in a lot of other situations in the future. So this was a very good thing to start off with, but it's not going to be our final setting of movement. To start off here, what we're going to want to do is go into Unity. And we're going to want to add to our spaceship, or our player thing, we're going to want to find a rigid body 2D. Not the rigid body, but the rigid body 2D. And we click that, and it'll add this kind of guy on it. Now this guy's going to do something funny if you click play, so let's just kind of see that. He's going to make, you fall. Because by default, this guy thinks you're in like a 2D platformer, like side-scroller thing, like Mario or something like that. So it thinks that, oh, you should fall because you're not on the ground or anything, so it tries to make you fall. But for our game, since it's top-down, we don't really have gravity in that kind of perspective. So what we're going to do is on our rigid body, we're going to change gravity scale to 0. And then that'll fix the issue with the thing with our guy falling down. Okay, so now we should just stand still and it can still move. So what is this rigid body thing in the first place? I probably didn't explain that right away. But the rigid body is something that just allows a game object to kind of have a physical interaction. So it will start to have velocity. If we did have gravity, you already saw that it would just kind of start pulling the object down as if there was gravity. It'll also then, when we further input this, it'll also help with the tracking of collisions, which we'll be doing in a little bit. First of all, let's just make this movement switch over from translate to moving with our rigid body. So the rigid body will allow us to move in a physical way, so it actually has something that's like a velocity that we move at a certain speed, and the physics engine kind of calculates that and smoothly moves us from like one point to another. So to get into that, we're going to want to go to our code. Underneath public speed, where we put that thing, we're going to go enter, and we want to this time type private. And it's private because we don't want this to be shown in the editor. We're going to say rigid body 2D, and I'm going to call this thing rigid. Yet again, I recommend you follow this name just to make it easier for when you're kind of following along. So I just called it rigid. Now this doesn't have a value by default, right? It's not like transform, which already has kind of a value. We just declared this variable here, but it doesn't have a value. So what we need to do is we need to actually find this rigid body. And so the rigid body we're trying to find is this rigid body here on our game object. And it's on the same game object that our player script is located. So because it's on the same game object that our player is located, we're able to do something called getComponent. But first of all, what we have to do is we have to say rigid equals. So we're giving rigid body a value. So we're assigning rigid body a value of, and we're doing getComponent rigid body 2D. And it has these kind of less than and greater than symbols on the side of the rigid body 2D. It's ended with some parentheses and a semicolon. And what this guy does is he finds a component of a specific type, so this case is rigid body, on the game object, whatever game object the player script is located. So all this is doing, if we save, won't physically do much on the game perspective, but when this game starts, when this guy gets initialized, he's going to wake up, he's going to say, hey, get me a component of rigid body. It's going to find this rigid body component. And then it's going to assign our variable of rigid to rigid body 2D. Okay, so now that we have our rigid variable, we're actually going to want to do something with it. And so we're going to be doing something where we completely remove all of our old movement code, and we're going to be replacing it with a different way of moving. So this different way of moving will be based on the rigid body, but first of all we're going to make another variable called a vector2. I'm going to call it velocity. So this is the thing that's going to be tracking our speed, and it's going to be equal to new vector2. I'm just going to type in 0, 0 here for a second. So a vector2 is just a coordinate that has an x and a y value, basically. So it's just a collection of two numbers, and the first one's called x, and the second one's called y in the simplest forms. And so this is used in Unity to track positions, and then it's also used to track how fast something is going. So if something has a velocity of 5 and 0, that means it's moving 5 units to the right every second, right? And so if we were just to sub in right now our speed into the x value here, this would be now saying that we have, it's a vector2 that's a velocity of speed to the right per second. Now this still doesn't do anything because it's just declaring a variable, but if we wanted our rigid body to have that velocity, we'd go rigid dot velocity equals velocity. Okay, and so what this does is now sets the velocity of the rigid body, which is the physics component. So it's saying you should go this fast per second, and we're setting that to the speed in the right direction. So obviously this doesn't have input yet, but we'll get there. Just see what this happens, what this does when we go to play. And we see we move to the right. If we were to end this and we can change the velocity to negative, we'll see that we also go to the other direction. It's kind of fun. Anyhow, okay, so let's get out of there. And in our update here, we're going to switch over from speed to something else that's driven by input. We're not going to do the get key this time, because get key is kind of like a one press for doing something for an A key or a D key. We're going to do something a little bit more extendable. And this one still does input as the beginning part of it, but instead of input get key, we're going to do input get access. That's the first one that actually shows up here. Get access also needs some parentheses, so we're going to put those up. And then it wants some text in here. And so the text that we're going to be putting inside here is horizontal. So now we have, instead of speed, we have input.getAxis horizontal. If we save that and we go into our game, you should now be able to press the A and D keys and you'll be moving left to right. It'll be pretty slow because it's only moving 1 unit to the left or 1 unit to the right at any one point, but it's moving. And so this is kind of how input horizontal works. It gives you a value of -1 to 1. But you may be asking, like, what is this horizontal? Why is it called horizontal? Well, if you go into File, Edit, and click on Project Settings, it'll open up this kind of tab. It might be out for you, so it might be like, might start out like this, but you can just drag it and drop it onto here, which is what I often do here. And you go to the Input section. There's this section called Axes. And then if you open that up, you'll see that there is, open it up and maybe drag it over to the side a little bit. There's a horizontal axis. So if we open that up, you'll see that there's a negative button, a positive button, an alt negative button, and an alt positive button. And so this left is interpreted as the left arrow key, and right is the right arrow key. A is obviously A key, and D is D key. And what this does is if you're pressing on a positive key, it gives you back a value of 1. If you're pressing on a negative key, it gives you a value of -1. And if you're pressing on nothing, it gives you back 0. So it kind of gives you a direction of input. And we can use that when we're doing our velocity, so that if you're pressing the positive button, you're going to the right. So that's already adding on the X. And then if you're going negative, that's subtracting from the X position. And so you're going to go backwards. And all this is defining is the keys that you can press. You'll also notice if you are in play mode right now, you'll actually be able to press the side left and right arrows. So it does do multiple inputs. It also has another definition lower down. You'll see a horizontal showing up again. And this is for joysticks. So you can actually have a controller hooked up to your computer, and that input will also work with the left joystick, moving left to right. So it handles all of that on its own. Now obviously we don't want just one direction of input, so we'll put in our second set of input. And for this I'm just going to copy this input.getAxis horizontal. I'm going to put it over here, and then we want to look over to Unity and say, okay, well, what's the thing for going up and down? Well, you can look and you can find this thing called vertical. So it has down for the negative, up for the positive, and S for the other negative, and W for the other positive. So that's exactly what we want. So what we do is then we type exactly vertical in here. Now you have to type it exactly right, otherwise it will not work. If you type it in as something like a lowercase v, for example, I'll just show you what happens. First of all, you won't get any up and down movement, but also your game will just break, like you can't move at all. And you'll see right now that there's this thing called an argument exception. Input axis is vertical, input axis vertical is not set up. So it's saying there's nothing in here that's called lowercase v vertical, and it's just going to throw this exception. So this is another error but this is what we would refer to as a runtime error because it's happening while the game is running. And whenever there's a runtime error like this, whatever line it happens at, the code won't get past this. So it'll only go to this point and saying, oh, there's an error here. It won't go anything down here. And that's why we're not even getting movement for our left to right, because all we're doing is doing this line, and then there's an error coming up, and then it's breaking. And so that's just kind of a side note on runtime errors, but also that you need to really make sure that these are correctly spelled, otherwise it won't work. If I correct this now though, and I save, and go back to Unity, it should be good. Alright, there we go. So now I got some movement. And now we still have the same issue that we had last time, where in our last game where 1 is really, really slow, right? Moving this thing at 1 unit per second is very, very slow. Luckily, we already have our speed variable, so all we have to do is take speed, put right before the semicolon, do times by speed. Oh, what am I doing? Times by speed. Why is it? Oh, I'm going crazy. Okay. Speed. There we go. I don't know what my mouse was doing. It's doing some crazy stuff. Yeah, so all you have to do is times this entirety of this vector 2 by the speed, and that'll increase the speed for both the x and the y by our speed value. If we then save that again and stop Unity and restart it, we should now have our speed back. Okay. The only other thing we'll probably want to talk about before I stop this video and go into the next part is just there's this slight amount of kind of like, it feels like almost drag or almost like lag, it feels sometimes when you move this, and so you let off and it kind of goes off and you kind of slide for a little bit. It also takes a little bit of time. It's really hard to notice, but it takes a little bit of time to kind of go back and forth between the inputs. And maybe that's something that's you like, in case that's fine. But if you don't like it, kind of like I don't, there's a thing you can do inside these axes. And what you'll want to do is look at gravity and sensitivity. And so gravity will determine how fast it'll come down. So if you're pressing it and you're letting go, it'll determine how fast that goes back to 0. And then sensitivity is how fast when pressing it, it'll go up. So gravity, if we change that up to something higher, and sensitivity up to something higher on both horizontal and vertical, we will then get a kind of snappier change. It's also important to note that you can do this in play mode, and it'll be fine. It'll save out. This is one of the few. Actually, it doesn't. No, I thought it did. Never mind. Okay. So you just make sure to change this outside of play mode, I guess. Then I didn't know you could. It would revert. In older versions, I think it didn't. Anyhow, that's our kind of movement, and now it's a little bit snappier. I'm going to cut this one here, and then on the next video we'll go into collisions with physics.